with everybody else. And I know people think, but that's not fair to those that have come here illegally.
Isn't that what we have now? If somebody doesn't feel they have the opportunity in America, they can go back anytime they want to.
Yes, we'd have a card that indicates who's here illegally. And if people are not able to have a card and have that through an e-verify system determine that they are here illegally, then they're going to find they can't get work here. And if people don't get work here, they're going to self-deport to a place where they can get work. Ultimately, with this transition period in place, we would then allow people to get in line at home and to come back to this country after they've reached the front of the line. But I just don't think it's fair to the people who have loved ones waiting in line legally to come to America and say, guess what? We're going to encourage a wave of illegal immigration again by giving amnesty of some kind to those that have come here illegally.
Senator Santorum, self-deportation, is that a valid concept?
Well, it's happening now. I mean, people are going back now because they can't find jobs because of the lack of employment opportunities. The bottom line is that if you do enforce the law and say that people who are here illegally, who are doing illegal acts, and that is working, which you're not allowed to do, and if you're working, probably you've stolen someone's Social Security number, which you're not allowed to do, and that's another law that is broken, that we should enforce the law. It's not someone who's come here illegally in the first place. They've only broken the law once. They continually break the law in this country, and I don't think that's something that should be rewarded. Our country, my father came to this country, my grandfather came to this country. He left my dad behind for 5 years. My dad was out without a dad for almost the first 5 years of his life. And there are millions of stories across America of people making sacrifices because America was worth it to do it the right way. You come to this country and the first thing you do is to respect our laws. To respect, if you want to be an American, you respect the laws of America. And you do so continually while you're here. We reward that kind of behavior. We don't reward behavior of where you don't respect our laws in your initial act and then you continually break the laws in order to stay here.
Speaker Gingrich, in Iowa, you are a big supporter of ethanol subsidies. Here in Florida, sugar is a very important industry, and it's subsidized as well with import restrictions, quotas. There's a conservative movement to do away with these programs. In the case of sugar, critics say it adds billions of dollars to consumers' grocery bills every year. What would you do about that?
Well, I pretty enthusiastically early in my career kept trying to figure out how to get away from the sugar subsidy. And I found out one of the fascinating things about America, which was that cane sugar hides behind beet sugar. And there are just too many beet sugar districts in the United States. It's an amazing side story about how interest groups operate. In an ideal world, you would have an open market. And I think that would be a better future, and frankly one where cane sugar would still make a lot of money. But it's very hard to imagine how you're going to get there. I spent a lot of time trying to reform agriculture when I was Speaker, and I would say it was one of the 2 or 3 hardest things to try to do because the capacity of the agricultural groups to defend themselves is pretty amazing.
Governor Romney, you're getting some campaign support from sugar growers. It's a very influential group in the states. What's your view on the sugar subsidies?
Yeah, my view is we ought to get rid of subsidies and let markets work properly. But let's step back for a second and talk about what's really going on in Florida right now. And you both know what's going on here. I spent time this morning with 8 different individuals, listening to them talk about their circumstances. There are a lot of people in Florida that are hurting. You got a lot of homes underwater. This president came into office saying he'd turn this economy around, and everything he has done has made it harder for the people of Florida. We have 25 million Americans out of work. We have, in Florida, 9.9% unemployed. We have 18% of our people in this state that are underemployed. Home values, 40% are underwater. This president has failed miserably the people of Florida. His plans for NASA, he has no plans for NASA. The Space Coast is struggling. This president has failed the people of Florida. We have to have a president who understands how to get an economy going again. He does not. He plays 90 rounds of golf when you have 25 million people out of work. He says gasoline prices doubled during his presidency. He says don't build a Keystone pipeline. We have $15 trillion of debt. We're headed to a Greece-type collapse. And he adds another trillion on top for Obamacare and for his stimulus plan that didn't create private sector jobs. This president has failed, and this economy needs a president who understands this economy.
Florida's Everglades provide 1 in 3 Floridians with their drinking water. It affects thousands of jobs. Right now, there's a joint federal-state program to save what's left of the Everglades. Would you commit to continuing that federal financing of the Everglades preservation?
Sure. I don't see any reason to go. After that, I would still look into the details on whether that could be a state issue or not. But with all the wars going on and the economy is in shambles as it is and the unemployment, to worry about dealing with that program. We could do it in a theoretical sense, but I would see no reason to, complicate things. But I wouldn't have any desire to interfere with that.
At this point, we'll take another break. We'll return from Tampa with this line of questioning right after this.
National debate about Terry Schiavo, whether her feeding tube should be removed after the courts had ruled that she'd been in a vegetative state for years. You were at the center, at the front of advocating congressional intervention to keep her alive. You even came down here, came to her bedside after a fundraiser. Why should the government have more say in medical decisions like that than a spouse?
Well, number one, I didn't come to her bedside, but I did come down to Tampa. I was scheduled to come down anyway for that event, and so happened that this situation was going on. I did not call for congressional intervention. I called for a judicial hearing by an impartial judge at the federal level to review a case in which you had parents and a spouse on different sides of the issue. And these were constituents of mine. The parents happen to live in Pennsylvania. They came to me and made a very strong case that they would like to see some other pair of eyes, judicial eyes, look at it. And I agreed to advocate for those constituents, because I believe that we should give respect and dignity for all human life, irrespective of their condition. And if there was someone there that wanted to provide and take care of them, and they were willing to do so, I wanted to make sure that the judicial proceedings worked properly, and that's what I did, and I would do it again.
Do not resuscitate directives, do you think they're immoral?
No, I don't believe they're immoral. I mean, I think that's a decision that people should be able to make, and supported legislation in the past for them to make it.
Speaker Gingrich, in that case, the courts had ruled repeatedly. How does that square the Terry Schiavo action with your understanding of the Constitution and the separation of powers?
Well, look, I think that we go to extraordinary lengths, for example, for people who are on murderer's row. They have extraordinary rights of appeal. And you have here somebody who was in a coma, who had, on the one hand, her husband saying, let her die, and her parents saying, let her live. Now, it strikes me that having a bias in favor of life and at least going to a federal hearing, which would be automatic if it was a criminal on death row, that it's not too much to say, in some circumstances, your rights as an American citizen ought to be respected, and there ought to be at least a judicial review of whether or not in that circumstance you should be allowed to die, which has nothing to do with whether or not you as a citizen have a right to have your own end-of-life prescription, which is totally appropriate for you to do as a matter of your values in consultation with your doctor.
Congressman Paul, you're a doctor. What was your view of the Terry Schiavo case?
I find it so unfortunate. It's so unusual, too. That situation doesn't come up very often. It should teach us all a lesson to have living wills, or a good conversation with a spouse. I would want my spouse to make the decision, but it's better to have a living will. But I don't like going up the ladder. You know, we go to the federal courts and the Congress and on up. Yes, difficult decisions. Will it be perfect for everybody? Not. But I would have preferred to see the decision made at the state level. But I've been involved in medicine with things similar, but not quite as difficult as this. But usually we deferred to the family, and it wasn't made a big issue like this was. This was way out of proportion to what happens more routinely. But I think it should urge us all to try to plan for this and make sure either that one individual that's closest to you makes the decision, or you sign a living will, and this would have solved the whole problem.
Beth?
Governor Romney, this is the state that put the first men on the moon. America right now has no way to put people into space except to hitch a ride with the Russians. Meanwhile, the Chinese are ramping up their space program. At a time when you all want to shrink federal spending, should space exploration be a priority? Governor Romney?
It should certainly be a priority. What we have right now is a president who does not have a vision or a mission for NASA. And as a result of that, there are people on the Space Coast that are suffering. And Florida itself is suffering as a result. So what's the right way forward? Well, I happen to believe our space program is important not only for science, but also for commercial development and for military development. And I believe the right mission for NASA should be determined by a president, together with a collection of people from those different areas, from NASA, from the Air Force space program, from our leading universities, and from commercial enterprises. Bring them together, discuss a wide range of options for NASA, and then have NASA not just funded by the federal government, but also by commercial enterprises, have some of the research done in our universities. Let's have a collaborative effort with business, with government, with the military, as well as with our educational institutions. Have a mission, once again, excite our young people about the potential of space, and the commercial potential will pay for itself down the road. This is a great opportunity. Florida has technology. The people here on the Space Coast have technology and vision and passion that America needs, and with a president that is actually willing to create a mission and a vision for NASA and for space, we can continue to lead the world.
Speaker Gingrich, would you put more tax dollars into the space race and commit to putting an American on Mars instead of relying on the private sector?
Well, the two are not incompatible. For example, most of the great breakthroughs in aviation in the 20s and 30s were a result of prizes. Lindbergh flew to Paris for a $25,000 prize. I would like to see vastly more of the money spent encouraging the private sector into very aggressive experimentation. And I'd like to see a leaner NASA. I don't think building a bigger bureaucracy and having a greater number of people sit in rooms and talk gets you there. But if we had a series of goals that we were prepared to offer prizes for, there's every reason to believe that you have a lot of folks in this country and around the world who would put up an amazing amount of money and would make the Space Coast literally hum with activity because they'd be drawn to achieve these prizes. Going back to the moon permanently, getting to Mars as rapidly as possible, building a series of space stations and developing commercial space. There are a whole series of things you can do that could be dynamic that are more than just better government bureaucracy. They're fundamentally leapfrogging into a world where you're incentivizing people who are visionaries and people in the private sector to invest very large amounts of money in finding very romantic and exciting futures.
Speaker Gingrich, I have another question for you on another topic. You've talked about the millions of jobs created by the Reagan tax cuts. If tax cuts create jobs, why didn't the Bush tax cuts work?
Well, the Bush tax cuts, I think, in a period of great difficulty with the attack of 9/11 actually stopped us from going into a much deeper slump. I think we would have been in much, much worse shape, and I think most economists agree that in 2002 and 3 and 4 we'd have been in much worse shape without the Bush tax cuts. But you have to also look at the regulatory burden. The reason I called for repealing Dodd-Frank and for repealing Obamacare and for repealing Sarbanes-Oxley is you now have these huge layers of paperwork and government intervention and bureaucratic micromanagement that are crippling the American system and are making it much harder for us to create the kind of jobs we'd want. In North Dakota today, we have a boom in oil development. Unemployment's down to 3.2%. They've had 7 straight tax cuts at the state level because the oil was on private land. If that oil had been on public land, the environmentalists and Barack Obama would have stopped its development and North Dakota would be mired in 8 or 9% unemployment. So get the regulations out of the way, get the tax incentives right, and you can get back to creating an amazing number of jobs very fast.
To my fellow questioners, our panelists tonight, my thanks. So ends this section of our conversation. The final bit of our debate from Tampa tonight coming up after this last break. This final section of our conversation tonight, we're back down to the 5 of us here on stage. I thought we'd talk a little bit more big picture. This has been called, in addition to this unprecedented primary contest the GOP is in the midst of, a battle for the soul of the Republican Party. Governor Romney, the question is about that soul, what have you done to further the cause of conservatism as a Republican leader?
Well, number one, I've raised a family, and I've with my wife, we've raised 5 wonderful sons, and we have 16 wonderful grandkids. Number two, I've worked in the private sector. The idea that somehow everything important for conservatism or for America happens in government is simply wrong. I've been in the private sector. I worked in one business that was in trouble and helped turn it around. Another I started, and as part of that, we were able to create thousands and thousands of jobs. And then I took an opportunity to become governor of a state that was slightly Democrat. About 85% of my legislature was Democrat, and I worked very hard to promote a conservative agenda. We cut taxes 19 times. We balanced the budget every year, put in place a rainy day fund of over $2 billion by the time I left. We're also successful in having English immersion in our schools, driving our schools to be